I was sorting through Armando's coat pockets when I found the birthday card. The handwriting was feminine, delicate. Happy birthday, my love. From your devoted wife, Cecilia, and little Deborah. The words hit me like ice water. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, still holding the card. For 13 years, I had trusted every story about his sick sister in Puebla, every monthly check, every weekend trip. I took a deep breath and reached for the phone. His workplace confirmed what I already suspected. He wasn't where he claimed to be. I smiled then, a strange calm washing over me. But there was something he didn't know, something I had discovered that would change everything. My name is Teresa, and this is how I learned that some betrayals become the greatest gifts of all. That birthday card with Cecilia's delicate handwriting still haunts me. 13 years. That's how long I had been sending our grocery money, our children's clothing money, to what I believed was his sick sister. 13 years of believing every lie that rolled off Armando's tongue like morning prayer. I remember the first time he mentioned Cecilia, back in 1965, just months after we married. We were sitting at our tiny kitchen table in our cramped apartment, and he pushed his plate away with that serious look he got when discussing family matters. Teresa, I need to tell you about my sister, he had said, his dark eyes avoiding mine. She lives in Puebla, and she's very ill. Diabetes complications. The doctors say she might not make it through the year. I was barely 17 then, pregnant with our first child, Carlos Eduardo. My heart immediately went out to this woman I had never met. What does she need? I asked, already reaching for our small savings jar on the kitchen shelf. Just what we can spare, Armando replied, taking my hand gently. Maybe 20 pesos a month, just until she gets back on her feet. 20 pesos became 30. 30 became 50. By 1978, we were sending nearly 100 pesos monthly to Puebla, money that could have bought shoes for our growing children or repairs for our leaking roof. Every time I questioned the amount, Armando would describe Cecilia's worsening condition with such detail that I felt guilty for even asking. She can barely walk now, Teresa. Her feet are so swollen, she can't work at the market anymore. And little Deborah, her daughter, she's trying to care for her mother while going to school. They depend on us. I never questioned why Cecilia never wrote to thank us. I never questioned why Armando never invited his sick sister to visit us in Mexico City, where she could receive better medical care. I never questioned why, in 13 years of marriage, I had never once spoken to this woman who was supposedly so important to my husband's heart. I was a devoted wife, raised to trust my husband's word as gospel truth. But that birthday card changed everything. The handwriting was too steady for someone with severe diabetes complications. The ink was fresh, not the shaky scrawl of an invalid. And the words, "Happy birthday, my love," from your devoted wife, Cecilia, and little Deborah, burned into my memory like acid on metal. Wife, not sister. Wife. I sat there in our bedroom, holding that card, feeling the ground shift beneath me like an earthquake. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. My hands began to shake as the implications crashed over me in waves. I walked to the kitchen and made coffee with mechanical precision, my mind racing through every memory, every conversation, every excuse Armando had given me over the years. The weekend trips to check on Cecilia's health, the extra shifts he claimed to work to cover her medical bills. The way he never let me answer the phone when it rang late at night, always claiming it was work-related. Emergencies on the road, he would say, disappearing into our bedroom to take the calls in private. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I had missed it for so long. Every monthly payment coincided with Armando claiming he needed to work extra routes. Every Christmas, he would leave us to spend the holiday with poor, lonely Cecilia, who couldn't travel in her condition. Every time I suggested we all take a family trip to Puebla to meet his sister and bring her gifts in person, he would find reasons why it wasn't possible. The roads were too dangerous. Her condition was too fragile for visitors. She was too proud to accept charity in person. I remember the Christmas of 1976 especially clearly now. 11, Maria Guadalupe was 9, and little Jose Antonio was just 6. They had saved their pocket money to buy a small gift for their Aunt Cecilia, a handkerchief with blue flowers that Maria Guadalupe had seen at the market. "Can we write her a letter, Mama?" Maria Guadalupe had asked with innocent excitement. "Can we tell her about school and our Christmas pageant?" I had looked at Armando expectantly, waiting for him to encourage this sweet gesture from his children. Instead, his face had gone pale. "She doesn't read very well," he said quickly. "The diabetes has affected her eyesight." It would only make her feel bad about her limitations. My heart had ached for this poor woman who couldn't even enjoy letters from her nieces and nephews. I had hugged Maria Guadalupe and told her we would pray for Aunt Cecilia instead. But now I understood the real reason. There was no sick sister to receive our children's letters. There was another woman, another family, another life that Armando was protecting from discovery. The coffee grew cold as I sat there, calculating the money. 13 years of payments, at least 8,000 pesos, maybe more. Money that could have given my children better clothes, better food, maybe even a larger apartment. Money that had been stolen from us through lies and manipulation. I felt something hardening inside my chest, something cold and determined that I had never experienced before. This wasn't just about money. This was about the theft of truth, the violation of trust, the mockery of everything I believed about my marriage. I thought about my mother's warnings before I married Armando. "Teresa, you barely know this man," she had pleaded. 6 months of courtship is not enough to know someone's character. What do you really know about his family, his past, his intentions? But I had been 17 and in love, convinced that my feelings were enough to build a solid marriage on. I had defended Armando passionately, insisting that love conquered all obstacles. How naive I had been, how foolishly, dangerously naive. The realization hit me that this deception might be even deeper than I initially thought. If Armando could lie about having a sister for 13 years, what else could he lie about? How much of our marriage was built on fiction? I began to question everything I thought I knew about the man I had shared a bed with for over a decade, the father of my children, the person I had trusted with my life and my future. That night, when Armando came home from what he claimed was a 3-day delivery route to Guadalajara, I watched him with new eyes. He kissed me on the forehead as always, asked about the children as always, complained about the traffic and bad food on the road as always. But now I could see the performance in it, the careful way he maintained his stories, the practiced ease with which he slipped back into his role as my devoted husband. It was like watching an actor I had never realized was acting. The most painful part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the slow recognition of my own blindness, my willingness to accept explanations that should have raised obvious questions. I had been so eager to be a good wife, so committed to trusting my husband, that I had ignored my own instincts countless times. There had been moments when something felt wrong, when his explanations didn't quite add up, when I had felt a flutter of doubt in my stomach. But I had pushed those feelings down, told myself that doubt was a weakness, that love meant accepting your partner completely. Now I understood that love without truth is not love at all. It's performance, pretense, a mockery of the real thing. I had been living in a play where I didn't even know the script, where my co-star had been improvising lies for 13 years while I delivered my lines with sincere conviction. The humiliation was almost unbearable, but beneath it, something stronger was growing. a determination to know the truth, whatever the cost. I began to notice things I had overlooked before. Armando's work clothes always smelled different when he returned from his Puebla runs, not like truck exhaust and roadside diners, but like perfume and home cooking. His hands were too clean, his appearance too neat for someone who had supposedly been driving for hours on dusty roads. And the money he claimed to earn from these special runs never quite matched what he brought home. There were always expenses, complications, reasons why his extraordinary efforts on behalf of his sister left our own finances unchanged. The birthday card had been like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed. Suddenly, doors were opening in my mind, revealing rooms full of inconsistencies and lies that I had carefully avoided examining for over a decade. The man I thought I knew was dissolving before my eyes, replaced by a stranger whose capacity for deception was breathtaking in its scope and duration. I realized that discovering the truth about Cecilia was just the beginning. I needed to understand the full extent of what Armando had hidden from me, and I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. After finding that birthday card, I knew I couldn't continue living in ignorance. But I also couldn't confront Armando directly. Not yet. I needed proof, evidence, something more substantial than a suspicious birthday greeting. So I began to watch and listen with new purpose, paying attention to details I had previously dismissed as unimportant. The pattern of deception that emerged was so systematic, so carefully constructed, that it took my breath away. Armando had created an entire alternate reality around his supposed sister. He spoke about Cecilia's health with genuine emotion, describing her struggles with such convincing detail that I sometimes wondered if he had convinced even himself that this version was true. He would return from his visits with specific stories about her condition, updates from her doctor, messages of gratitude that she had supposedly asked him to pass along to me. The performance was flawless, except for the birthday card that had accidentally revealed the truth. I realized that this kind of sustained deception required more than just casual lying. This was a double life, maintained with military precision and psychological sophistication. Armando wasn't just unfaithful. He was living as two completely different people, with two separate families who each believed they knew the real man. The implications were staggering. If he could maintain such an elaborate fiction about Cecilia, what else was he hiding? How much of our entire marriage was built on lies? The most disturbing part was recognizing how skillfully he had manipulated my emotions to maintain his deception. Every time I expressed concern about our finances or suggested we needed to spend less on Cecilia's care, Armando would paint such a heartbreaking picture of his sister's suffering that I felt guilty for my selfishness. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, how to make me feel ashamed for questioning his generosity toward family. He had weaponized my compassion against me, using my good heart to fund his betrayal. I began to understand that I was dealing with someone whose capacity for deception went far beyond ordinary marital infidelity. This was systematic psychological manipulation, sustained over more than a decade, involving not just lies, but the construction of entirely false relationships and responsibilities. Armando had made me complicit in funding his other life while believing I was performing an act of Christian charity. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The recognition was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that virtually nothing about our marriage was what I had believed it to be. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to preserve something that had never really existed. I wasn't destroying a marriage. I was revealing that there had never been a real marriage to destroy. What we had was a performance, and I had been the only sincere actor on the stage. I found myself studying Armando's behavior with clinical detachment, like a scientist observing a fascinating but dangerous specimen. I noticed how he compartmentalized his different lives, how he could switch from loving husband to devoted provider for his sick sister, without any apparent internal conflict. There was no guilt in his face, no struggle with conscience. He seemed to inhabit each role completely while he was in it, as if the other roles simply didn't exist in those moments. This realization taught me something crucial about the nature of deception. Armando wasn't struggling with conflicted loyalties or torn between competing loves. He had simply decided that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. The elaborate story about Cecilia wasn't born from internal conflict. It was a tool, carefully crafted and maintained because it served his purposes. I was married to someone who viewed other people as resources to be managed rather than human beings deserving of truth and respect. Understanding this pattern was essential because it meant I couldn't approach this situation as if I were dealing with ordinary marital problems. This wasn't about communication issues or conflicting priorities. This was about fundamental differences in how we viewed morality, truth, and the obligations we owe to the people who trust us. Armando had revealed himself to be someone who could sustain elaborate deceptions without apparent psychological cost, someone for whom lying was not a moral struggle but simply a practical tool. Once I recognized the systematic nature of his deception, I knew that confrontation alone would be useless. Someone who could lie so completely for so long wouldn't suddenly become honest when challenged. He would simply adapt his lies, create new stories, find new ways to manipulate my emotions and doubts. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. If I wanted justice, I would have to create it myself. And if I wanted a different future, I would have to build it myself. The birthday card had been my awakening, but understanding the full pattern of deception was my education. Now I needed to decide what to do with what I had learned. I could continue living in the false reality Armando had constructed, pretending I didn't know what I now knew. Or I could take action to discover the full truth and reclaim control over my own life. For the first time in 13 years, I felt ready to stop being a victim of someone else's choices and start making real decisions of my own. This recognition marked a turning point in my understanding of myself as much as my marriage. I realized that I had been living as a supporting character in someone else's story, accepting whatever role Armando assigned me without questioning whether that role served my own interests or values. But now, I was ready to become the protagonist of my own life, to make decisions based on truth rather than illusion, to choose my future rather than simply accept whatever someone else had planned for me. The moment I decided to take action, I felt something shift inside me that I had never experienced before. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It wasn't fear, though I was certainly afraid of what I might discover. It was more like waking up after a very long sleep, like seeing clearly for the first time in years. I felt alert, focused, and strangely calm. I had been living in someone else's dream for 13 years, and now I was finally ready to open my eyes. I knew I couldn't handle this alone. The scope of Armando's deception was beyond anything I had experience dealing with, and I needed help from someone who could guide me through the practical steps of discovering the truth and protecting myself and my children. That's when I thought of my friend Lourdes, who worked as a secretary in a law office downtown. She had mentioned her boss, Mr. Martinez, several times over the years, always speaking of him with great respect. He was a family lawyer who specialized in helping women navigate difficult domestic situations. At first, I felt ashamed at the thought of discussing my marriage problems with a stranger, especially a man. In 1978, divorce was still relatively uncommon in our community, and women who sought legal advice about their husbands were often viewed with suspicion or pity. But my situation was beyond the reach of traditional social solutions. I couldn't turn to family members who would expect me to forgive and forget in the name of preserving the marriage. I couldn't seek counsel from friends who had never faced anything like this. I needed professional help from someone who understood the legal and practical implications of what I was facing. I called Lourdes on a Tuesday morning after Armando had left for what he claimed was a delivery run to Veracruz. My hands were shaking as I dialed her number at the law office, but my voice was steady when she answered. Lourdes, I need your help with something very serious, I said without preamble. I can't discuss it over the phone, but I need to speak with Mr. Martinez about a legal matter, a family matter. There was a pause, and then Lourdes said simply, "Come in this afternoon. He'll see you." Mr. Martinez was a small, neat man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put me at ease. His office was lined with law books and family photographs, and he offered me coffee before asking what had brought me to see him. I had rehearsed what I would say, but when the moment came, the words poured out of me like water through a broken dam. I told him about the birthday card, about the 13 years of payments to the supposedly sick sister, about my growing suspicions that nothing about this story was true. He listened without interruption, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Teresa," he said gently, "what you're describing sounds like a pattern of sustained deception that could constitute fraud, even within a marriage. But before we discuss your legal options, I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you prepared to discover that your suspicions are correct? Are you ready to learn the truth, even if it means your marriage cannot continue as it has been?" The question hit me like a physical blow, but I knew the answer immediately. "Yes," I said. "I need to know the truth. I can't live with these lies anymore, whatever the cost." He nodded approvingly. "Then we need to approach this systematically. Confronting your husband without evidence will likely result in more sophisticated lies, not honest answers. We need to gather facts first, then decide how to proceed based on what we find." Mr. Martinez explained that there were legal ways to investigate whether Armando was indeed supporting a sick sister in Puebla, or whether something else entirely was happening with our money. He could make inquiries through official channels, check records, verify or debunk the story Armando had been telling. But he warned me that this process would take time, and that I needed to be prepared for the possibility that the deception was even more extensive than I suspected. "In cases like this," he said carefully, "the initial deception is often just the surface of something larger. If your husband is capable of maintaining such an elaborate fiction for over a decade, he may have constructed an entire alternate life that you know nothing about. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about the birthday card, about the words "devoted wife" and the child's signature, and I nodded. "I think I already know," I said. "I just need proof." He outlined a plan that would allow us to investigate without alerting Armando to our suspicions. First, we would verify whether there actually was a Cecilia at the address where Armando claimed to be sending money. Then we would determine the nature of any relationship between Armando and this woman. Finally, we would document whatever we discovered in a way that would protect my interests and those of my children, regardless of what we found. The plan required me to gather specific information: addresses, account numbers, dates of payments, anything that could help us trace where the money had actually gone and what it had purchased. I would need to search through Armando's papers when he was away, looking for evidence of the life he was hiding from me. The thought of searching through my husband's private belongings made me feel sick, but I knew it was necessary. The man I had trusted to be honest with me had proven that trust was misplaced. Now I had to treat him as what he had revealed himself to be, someone whose word could not be believed. Mr. Martinez also explained my legal rights regarding our shared finances and property. Even though Mexico's divorce laws were quite restrictive in 1978, there were still ways to protect myself and my children if my marriage ended. He helped me understand what documentation I would need to gather, what steps I should take to secure my financial future, and how to prepare for the possibility that I might soon be supporting my family alone. The most important thing he told me was that I shouldn't confront Armando until we had gathered sufficient evidence and I had made concrete plans for my future. Women in your situation often want to have an honest conversation with their husbands, to give them a chance to explain or change their behavior, he said. But someone who has maintained this level of deception for this long is not going to suddenly become honest when challenged. Your goal should be to protect yourself and your children, not to save a marriage that may have been built on lies from the beginning. This advice was both difficult and liberating to hear. Difficult because it meant accepting that the marriage I had fought to preserve for 13 years might not be worth saving. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to fix a problem I hadn't created and couldn't control. I wasn't responsible for Armando's choices, but I was responsible for my own response to them. For the first time in my adult life, I was putting my own needs and those of my children ahead of my husband's convenience. Walking out of Mr. Martinez's office that afternoon, I felt different than I had in years. I had a plan, professional support, and most importantly, I had given myself permission to prioritize truth over comfort. I was no longer the naive 17-year-old who had married Armando, believing that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. I was a woman with 3 children and 13 years of experience, and I was finally ready to use that experience to build a better future for my family. The investigation that followed was like performing surgery on my own life. I had to systematically examine every assumption I had made about my marriage, every story I had accepted without question, every explanation that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared suspicious in retrospect. It was painful work, but it was also empowering. For the first time in years, I was seeking truth rather than avoiding it, making decisions based on facts rather than hopes. I began by searching through Armando's desk when he was away on his routes. Hidden beneath a stack of truck maintenance records, I found a small address book with entries that made my blood run cold. There were multiple addresses in Puebla, phone numbers with women's names beside them, and notations about payments and dates that corresponded exactly with the money he had claimed to be sending to his sick sister. But the most devastating discovery was a receipt from a jewelry store in Puebla, dated just 3 months earlier, for a gold bracelet that cost more than what he brought home from 2 months of work. The receipt was addressed to Senior Armando Lopez at an address I had never seen before. The purchase was clearly for someone special, someone he wanted to impress with expensive gifts while his own children wore secondhand clothes, and I struggled to stretch our grocery budget to cover basic needs. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. He was using money intended for our family's welfare to buy luxury gifts for his other life, and he was doing it with such systematic regularity that he kept the receipts in an organized file. But the most damning piece of evidence was a letter I found tucked inside one of his work shirts, apparently forgotten after one of his delivery runs. It was written in the same delicate handwriting I had seen on the birthday card, but this time, the content left no doubt about the true nature of Armando's relationship with Cecilia. "My darling husband," it began, "Deborah and I missed you so much during your week in Mexico City. She asks about her papa every day, and I have to explain again why you can't live with us all the time like other fathers. When will you be able to leave that job and come home to us permanently?" Reading that letter, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal. Deborah wasn't just some child Cecilia was caring for. She was Armando's daughter, my children's half-sister, a little girl who had been waiting years for her father to abandon us and commit fully to her family. The letter went on to describe domestic details that painted a picture of a complete alternate household, school events Armando had attended, neighbors he knew by name, a church where he was known as Cecilia's husband and Deborah's father. The letter made it clear that this wasn't just an affair or even a case of bigamy. This was a complete double life, with Armando maintaining two entirely separate identities in two different cities. In Mexico City, he was my husband, father to Carlos Eduardo, Maria Guadalupe, and Jose Antonio, a hardworking truck driver supporting his family and his sick sister. In Puebla, he was Cecilia's husband, Deborah's father, a man with a demanding job that unfortunately required him to travel frequently, but who always came home to his loving family. Both women had been living in a carefully constructed fiction, each believing she knew the real Armando, while he compartmentalized his life so completely that he could inhabit both roles without apparent psychological conflict. The sophistication of the deception was breathtaking, but so was its fundamental cruelty. He had stolen 13 years of honest life from me, and apparently several years from Cecilia as well, creating false realities that served only his desires while leaving both of his families incomplete and deceived. I took the letter and the jewelry receipt to Mr. Martinez the next day, along with copies of the address book entries and records of all the money transfers over the years. The evidence was overwhelming, but he warned me that confronting Armando directly could result in him simply disappearing, leaving both families without support or answers. Instead, he suggested a more strategic approach that would force Armando to reveal the truth, while preserving my ability to protect my children's interests. The plan was both elegant and devastating in its simplicity. I would travel to Puebla unannounced, using the address from the jewelry store receipt, and confront Cecilia directly. This would accomplish several things at once. I would get definitive proof of what I already suspected. I would be able to assess whether Cecilia was a willing participant in the deception or another victim like myself. And most importantly, I would force the situation into the open in a way that Armando couldn't control or manipulate. Mr. Martinez arranged for a trusted investigator to accompany me to Puebla, someone who could document whatever we found and serve as a witness if legal proceedings became necessary. He also helped me prepare for the practical aftermath. What to do if Armando reacted violently to being exposed, how to protect my children from the emotional fallout, how to secure our finances in case he abandoned us entirely. The most difficult part of the preparation was deciding what to tell my children. Carlos Eduardo was 13 now, old enough to understand that something serious was happening, but not old enough to handle the full truth about his father's betrayal. I decided to tell them that I needed to make an important trip related to Papa's work, that they would stay with my mother while I was gone, and that we would have a family discussion when I returned. It wasn't the complete truth, but it would have to suffice until I knew more about what our future would look like. The night before I left for Puebla, I sat in my kitchen looking around at the modest home Armando and I had built together over 13 years. The mismatched furniture we had accumulated piece by piece, the children's artwork taped to the refrigerator, the small altar to the Virgin of Guadalupe, where I prayed every morning for my family's welfare. Everything looked the same, but I knew that by the time I returned, this life as I had known it would be over forever. I wasn't just going to Puebla to confront another woman about my husband's infidelity. I was going to dismantle a lie that had shaped every aspect of my existence for over a decade. I was going to meet the other victim of Armando's elaborate deception, and together we were going to force him to account for what he had stolen from both of us. Most importantly, I was going to reclaim my right to live in truth, whatever that truth might cost me. As I packed my small overnight bag, I realized that I was preparing for more than just a confrontation. I was preparing for a rebirth, for the chance to build a new life based on reality rather than illusion. The woman who returned from Puebla would not be the same person who had spent 13 years faithfully sending money to a husband's supposedly sick sister. She would be someone who had looked directly at a devastating truth and chosen to act on it rather than hide from it. The journey to Puebla felt both endless and too short. I sat on the bus, clutching the jewelry store receipt, watching the familiar landscape pass by, and knowing that I was traveling toward the end of everything I had believed about my life. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was determined. Armando had had 13 years to live according to his choices. Now it was time for me to start making choices of my own. The bus pulled into Puebla's central station just after noon on a Thursday, and I felt my heart hammering as I gathered my things and stepped onto the platform. Somewhere in this city was another version of my life, another woman who believed she was married to the man I called my husband, another child who called him Papa. In a few hours, both of our worlds would be shattered, but from those pieces, perhaps we could build something more honest and real than what we had been living with. Mr. Martinez's investigator, a quiet woman named Carmen who specialized in domestic cases, met me at the station. She had already located the address from the receipt and confirmed that it was a small dress shop with living quarters above it. "There's definitely a woman there with a young girl," she told me as we walked toward the taxi stand. "The neighbors know them as Senora Cecilia and her daughter Deborah, and they all know Armando as the husband who works in Mexico City and comes home on weekends." The taxi ride to Cecilia's address took only 15 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another dimension. This was the neighborhood where my husband had been living his other life, where he walked as a completely different person than the man I knew. These were the streets where he bought groceries for his other family, where he attended church services and school events, where he was known and welcomed as a member of a community that had no idea I existed. The dress shop was exactly what I had expected: small, neat, with a hand-painted sign reading Confecciones Cecilia and a window display of simple but well-made clothing. Through the glass, I could see a woman about my own age working at a sewing machine, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. This was her. This was the woman whose existence had been funded by the money I thought was going to charity, whose happiness had been built on the same foundation of lies that had undermined my own. Carmen suggested that I approach alone initially, that the confrontation might be less overwhelming for both of us without a witness present from the beginning. I agreed, though my legs felt shaky as I walked to the shop door and pushed it open. The bell above the door chimed softly, and the woman at the sewing machine looked up with a welcoming smile that quickly faded when she saw my face. "Senora Cecilia?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded warily, setting down her work. "I'm Teresa," I continued, watching for recognition in her eyes. "Armando's wife." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of her work table and stared at me as if I were a ghost. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Armando isn't married. He's my husband. We've been together for—" She stopped, her eyes widening as the implications hit her. "How long?" she asked in a voice barely above a breath. "How long have you been married to him?" 13 years, I replied. "Since 1965. We have 3 children." The silence that followed was deafening. Cecilia sank into her chair, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. From somewhere in the back of the shop, a young girl's voice called out, "Mama, who's there?" Cecilia glanced toward the back room, then looked at me with an expression of such devastation that I felt my anger begin to transform into something else entirely. Recognition of shared betrayal, mutual victimhood, the understanding that we had both been deceived by the same man in equally cruel ways. "Deborah," she called softly. "Come here, mija. There's someone you need to meet." The girl who emerged from the back room was perhaps 10 years old, with Armando's distinctive dark eyes and stubborn chin. She looked at me curiously, then at her mother's tear-stained face with growing alarm. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Who is this lady?" Cecilia took her daughter's hand and looked at me with a mixture of desperation and dignity. Deborah, this is Teresa. She's she's your father's other wife. You have brothers and sisters in Mexico City." The words hung in the air like broken glass, cutting all of us with their sharp edges. Deborah stared at me with the same shocked expression her mother had worn, trying to process information that would reshape her entire understanding of her family and her place in the world. I knelt down to the little girl's level, fighting back tears. "Hello, Deborah. Your father has told me about you, but he said your mother was his sister and that you were his niece." The child looked confused, glancing between her mother and me as if we were speaking a foreign language. "But Papa is married to Mama," she said with the certainty of childhood. "They had a wedding." I saw the pictures. That was when I understood the full scope of Armando's betrayal. He hadn't just been having an affair or maintaining a casual relationship with another woman. He had actually married Cecilia, probably using false documents or taking advantage of the poor record-keeping in smaller towns. Deborah wasn't just his biological daughter, she was his legitimate daughter in every legal and social sense that mattered, which meant that my own marriage, my children's legitimacy, everything I had built my life around, was built on a foundation of lies and fraud. Cecilia confirmed my fears. "We were married in 1969, she said through her tears, "in the church here in Puebla, with all my family present." He told me he was divorced, that his first wife had taken their children and moved to the United States. He said he came to Mexico City for work, but that his home was here with us. She showed me a wedding photograph from her mantle, Armando in a white guayabera, beaming as he held Cecilia's hand, both of them surrounded by smiling relatives I had never seen before. The photograph was dated October 1969, just 4 years after Armando and I had married, when Carlos Eduardo was 3 years old and Maria Guadalupe was still a baby. While I had been home caring for our toddlers, believing my husband was working hard to support our growing family, he had been planning and executing a second wedding to another woman in another city. The systematic nature of his deception was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. But as devastating as this revelation was, it also clarified something important. Cecilia wasn't a willing participant in adultery. She was another victim of Armando's elaborate fraud. She had been deceived just as thoroughly as I had, believing herself to be in a legitimate marriage with a man who sometimes had to travel for work. Neither of us had chosen to be part of a deceptive arrangement. We had both been manipulated into situations we would never have accepted if we had known the truth. This understanding changed the entire dynamic of our confrontation. Instead of rivals fighting over the same man, we were allies, discovering that we had both been victimized by someone whose capacity for deception went far beyond ordinary infidelity. Armando hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been systematically defrauding 2 families simultaneously, using each to justify his obligations to the other while serving only his own desires. Cecilia and I spent the rest of the afternoon sharing our stories, comparing the lies Armando had told each of us, piecing together the timeline of his deception. What emerged was a picture of a man who had been living not just a double life, but multiple interconnected lies that required constant maintenance and adjustment. Every story he told me about his sick sister corresponded to a story he told Cecilia about his demanding job in Mexico City. Every weekend he spent with her was justified to me as work obligations or family emergencies. The most painful part of our conversation was realizing how many opportunities we had both had to discover the truth earlier, if only we had been less trusting or more suspicious of inconsistencies in his stories. Sometimes Cecilia wondered why Armando's work kept him away so much, why he never invited her to visit Mexico City, why his colleagues never called the house. I had wondered why his sister never wrote to thank us for our help, why she never wanted to meet her nieces and nephews, why Armando was always so vague about her specific medical condition. But both of us had been raised to trust our husbands, to support their decisions without question, to interpret their secretiveness as dedication to providing for their families rather than evidence of betrayal. Armando had exploited these cultural expectations ruthlessly, using our socialized tendency to avoid conflict and trust male authority to maintain his elaborate deception for over a decade. As the afternoon wore on, our shock began to transform into something else. Anger, yes, but also a strange sense of relief. The truth was devastating, but it was still better than living in a lie. For the first time in years, both of us could see our situations clearly, without the distortion of Armando's carefully crafted stories. We were both victims, but we were no longer blind victims. We could finally begin to make decisions based on reality rather than illusion. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Confronting Armando seemed both necessary and potentially dangerous. If he could maintain such elaborate deceptions for so long, what else was he capable of? How would he react when his carefully constructed world collapsed? Carmen, the investigator, had been documenting our conversation from the street, and she confirmed that we now had more than enough evidence to prove fraud, bigamy, and systematic deception that could be prosecuted criminally if we chose that route. But legal prosecution wasn't our primary concern. Cecilia and I both had children to protect and futures to plan. The most important question wasn't how to punish Armando, but how to build stable, honest lives for our families in the aftermath of his betrayal. We needed to think strategically about our financial security, our children's emotional welfare, and our own paths forward as suddenly single mothers in a society that didn't make independence easy for women. As evening approached, we realized that we couldn't make these decisions alone or immediately. We needed time to process what we had learned, to consult with advisors who could help us understand our legal options, and to prepare our children for the changes that would inevitably come. But we also agreed that we couldn't allow Armando to continue his deception now that we both knew the truth. He would have to choose between his two lives, and more importantly, he would have to face the consequences of the damage he had already caused. That night, I stayed in a small hotel near Cecilia's shop, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my children back in Mexico City, about how I would explain to them that their father was not the man they thought he was, that their family was not what they had believed it to be. I thought about Deborah, whose entire understanding of her family structure had been shattered in the course of a single afternoon. And I thought about Cecilia, whose legitimate marriage had been revealed to be built on a foundation of lies about her husband's past and current obligations. But most of all, I thought about the future. For 13 years, I had been living according to someone else's plan, accepting whatever role Armando assigned me in his elaborate fiction. Now, suddenly, I had the opportunity to write my own story, to make decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than accommodating someone else's deception. It was terrifying, but it was also the first real freedom I had experienced since I was 17 years old. The next morning, Cecilia and I met again to plan our confrontation with Armando. We had decided that we would both be present when we revealed that we knew the truth, partly to prevent him from trying to manipulate either of us individually, and partly because we had discovered that facing this crisis together was less overwhelming than trying to handle it alone. We had been isolated by his deception, each believing we were the only ones dealing with his demands and limitations. Now that we could compare experiences and support each other, we felt stronger and more capable of demanding accountability. Carmen had helped us understand the legal implications of what we had discovered. Armando's bigamy was a criminal offense that could result in imprisonment, but proving it might be complicated by questions about which marriage was legally valid and whether the documents used for the second ceremony were fraudulent. More importantly, for our immediate purposes, Both Cecilia and I had claims on any property or assets Armando had accumulated during our respective marriages, and his systematic deception constituted grounds for divorce with favorable property settlements. But our primary goal wasn't legal victory. It was honest resolution. We wanted Armando to acknowledge what he had done, to take responsibility for the damage his deception had caused, and to make decisions about his future that didn't require continued lies to either of us. We were prepared for the possibility that he might choose to disappear entirely rather than face the consequences of his actions, but we agreed that even abandonment would be better than continued deception. The confrontation we had planned never happened quite the way we expected. Armando was supposed to arrive at Cecilia's shop that Friday evening, as he did most weekends. Cecilia and I were waiting for him, along with Carmen and Mr. Martinez, who had come to Puebla to ensure that everything was properly documented. But instead of Armando walking through the door at his usual time, we received a phone call from his trucking company. "Señora Lopez?" the voice on the phone asked when Cecilia answered. "This is Roberto from Transportes Hernandez. I'm calling because Armando didn't report for his Monday route, and we haven't been able to reach him all week. His supervisor wanted to know if there was a family emergency or if he's sick. Is everything all right?" Cecilia's face went white as she realized the implications. Armando had disappeared. Somehow, he had learned that his deception was discovered, and he had simply vanished rather than face the consequences. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and desperate attempts to locate someone who had seemingly evaporated into thin air. I called our apartment in Mexico City, but there was no answer. I called my mother, who confirmed that she still had the children, but that Armando hadn't been in contact with any of them. Cecilia called relatives and neighbors in Puebla, but no one had seen or heard from him since the previous weekend. By Saturday morning, it became clear that Armando's disappearance was complete and probably permanent. He had apparently liquidated whatever assets he could access quickly. His final paycheck from the trucking company had been collected. Our shared savings account in Mexico City had been emptied, and several items of value from both households were missing. He had taken enough money to fund a new start somewhere else, and he had left both of his families to deal with the wreckage of his deception. The practical implications were immediately overwhelming. Both Cecilia and I were suddenly single mothers with no steady income and children to support. The money that had been supporting both households was gone, along with the man whose lies had at least provided some financial stability. We were both facing the prospect of complete economic reconstruction while dealing with the emotional aftermath of having our lives revealed to be elaborate frauds. But there was also something liberating about Armando's disappearance. It meant we no longer had to manage the complex emotional work of confrontation, forgiveness, or attempted reconciliation. His choice to abandon both families rather than take responsibility for his actions was cruel, but it was also clarifying. We were both free to build new lives without having to navigate ongoing relationships with someone whose capacity for deception had been so thoroughly demonstrated. That weekend in Puebla, Cecilia and I began what would become a lifelong friendship and partnership. We realized that we had more in common than just shared victimization. We were both skilled seamstresses, both determined to provide better futures for our children, and both willing to work hard to build something positive from the ruins of our deception. Instead of remaining isolated in our respective cities, nursing our wounds separately, we decided to combine our resources and efforts. The idea of working together wasn't immediately obvious, but it grew naturally from our conversations about survival and recovery. Cecilia had her small dress shop and established customers in Puebla. I had more experience with bookkeeping and business planning from helping to manage our household finances for 13 years. Neither of us had enough resources to build stable futures alone, but together, we might be able to create something substantial enough to support both families. More importantly, we had learned through painful experience how much strength comes from having someone who truly understands your situation. Neither of us would ever again have to explain or justify our circumstances to someone who hadn't lived through similar betrayal. We could support each other through the practical challenges of single motherhood and business ownership, while also providing emotional understanding that no one else could offer. The decision to merge our lives and work was not made lightly or quickly. We spent weeks discussing the practical and emotional challenges, consulting with our advisors about the legal and financial implications, and most importantly, talking with our children about how this arrangement might affect their lives. But gradually, what had started as a crisis management strategy evolved into something more positive, a genuine partnership between two women who had discovered that they could build something better together than either could achieve alone. By the end of 1978, I had moved to Puebla with my children, and we had begun the process of expanding Cecilia's small shop into something more ambitious. We renamed it Confecciones Nuevo Comienzo, New Beginning Fashions, both as a symbol of our fresh start and as a promise to ourselves that we would not allow Armando's betrayal to define the rest of our lives. What he had meant as a cruel deception, we transformed into the foundation of our liberation and eventual prosperity. The transition wasn't easy. My children had to adjust to a new city, new schools, and the presence of a half-sister they had never known existed. Cecilia and Deborah had to welcome 3 strangers into their home and daily routines. All of us had to learn to function as an unconventional family unit while dealing with the ongoing emotional aftermath of discovering how thoroughly we had all been deceived. But we were determined to make it work, partly because we had limited alternatives, but mostly because we had discovered something powerful in our partnership. 2 women who had been isolated and controlled through deception had found strength, purpose, and genuine friendship in working together toward common goals. We were no longer victims of someone else's choices. We were partners in building our own futures. The business grew steadily through the 1980s, surviving economic crises and social prejudice against women business owners through a combination of excellent work, fair prices, and stubborn determination. Our children grew up together, supporting each other through the challenges of adolescence while learning valuable lessons about resilience, cooperation, and the importance of building lives based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. By the 1990s, Confecciones Nuevo Comienzo had become one of Puebla's most successful clothing businesses, with a reputation for quality work and ethical practices that reflected the values Cecilia and I had developed through surviving betrayal and building something better from the aftermath. Our children had all pursued education and careers that reflected their individual talents and interests, but they remained connected to the family business that had provided stability and opportunity for both families. When Cecilia died in 1995, after a 4-year battle with breast cancer, I lost not just a business partner, but the closest friend I had ever had. She had been the person who understood most intimately how I had survived the destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life, and who had worked beside me to build something honest and sustainable from those ruins. Her death was devastating, but it also confirmed something important about the life we had built together. What had started as a crisis management strategy between 2 deceived women had evolved into a genuine family business that provided opportunities and security for 2 generations. Cecilia's daughter, Deborah, continued as my partner in managing the business, bringing modern skills and perspectives that helped us adapt to changing markets and customer expectations. My own children contributed their professional expertise, Carlos Eduardo as an engineer helping us modernize our production processes, Maria Guadalupe as a fashion designer, updating our styles, Jose Antonio managing sales and customer relationships, and my youngest, Beatriz, handling legal aspects of our expanding business. The partnership that began from shared betrayal had become a legacy of cooperation and mutual support that extended into the next generation. Deborah and my children grew up as siblings in everything but biology, and they continued that relationship into their adult lives, treating business as a shared family enterprise rather than a commercial venture with competing interests. In 2007, Deborah established a charitable foundation focused on providing educational opportunities for children of single mothers, using some of the profits from our business to address problems she had experienced firsthand. Beatrice opened a law firm specializing in family law and women's rights, drawing on her understanding of the challenges women face when marriages end through betrayal or abandonment. Both initiatives reflected values we had developed through our experience: the importance of supporting other women facing similar challenges, and the obligation to use success achieved through surviving adversity to help others in comparable situations. The business continued to grow and adapt through the economic changes of the 2000s and 2010s. In 2018, we entered into a partnership with a national fashion retailer that allowed us to expand our market reach while maintaining the personal service and quality standards that had built our reputation. The partnership was structured to preserve our independence and values while providing access to larger markets and more sophisticated distribution systems. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, we were able to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, shifting to online sales and mask production in ways that kept our employees working and our customers served. The flexibility and resilience we had developed through decades of working together allowed us to navigate the crisis more successfully than many larger businesses that lacked our experience with adaptation and improvisation. Throughout all these years and changes, the core lesson of our experience remained constant: that some of life's most devastating betrayals can become the foundation for unexpected opportunities if we have the courage to build something new rather than simply mourning what was lost. Armando's deception had been cruel and systematic, designed to serve only his interests regardless of the cost to the women and children who trusted him. But our response to that deception had created something much more valuable than anything he had ever provided: a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to building futures worthy of the struggles we had survived. Now, at 76, I look back on that terrible day in 1978 when I found the birthday card and understand that it was not the end of my life, but the beginning of my real life. Everything before that moment had been built on someone else's lies and limitations. Everything after it was built on truth, hard work, and the extraordinary friendship between two women who refused to let betrayal define their futures. The legacy we built from that crisis continues to grow and evolve with each generation. My grandchildren and Deborah's children know the story of how their families came together, and they understand both the pain that initiated our partnership and the strength that has sustained it for over 4 decades. They have learned that families can be created through choice and commitment, as well as biology, and that the most important relationships are often those we build intentionally rather than those we inherit by accident. Today, Confecciones Nuevo Comienzo employs over 50 people and serves customers throughout central Mexico. But more importantly, it represents something that Armando never understood and could never have created: the power of genuine partnership between people committed to building something larger than their individual interests, something based on truth rather than deception, something designed to serve the next generation rather than just immediate personal desires. I have never seen or heard from Armando again after that weekend when he disappeared, rather than face the consequences of his deception. I don't know where he went or what became of him, and I have long since stopped caring. His absence from our lives proved to be a gift rather than a loss. allowing both families to develop in ways that would never have been possible under the constraints of his lies and limitations. The birthday card that started this entire journey is still tucked away in my jewelry box, not as a memento of betrayal, but as a reminder of the moment when I chose truth over comfort and began building a life worthy of the woman I was capable of becoming. Sometimes the most devastating discoveries become the most liberating if we have the courage to act on what we learn rather than pretend we never learned it. That choice, to seek truth rather than avoid it, to build something new rather than preserve something false, made all the difference in our lives and the lives of our children. It transformed what could have been a story of victimization into a story of empowerment, and what could have been a legacy of deception into a legacy of strength, cooperation, and genuine love. Sometimes the most painful discoveries become our greatest blessings, teaching us that we're stronger than we ever imagined. And that was today's story of how betrayal became the foundation for something beautiful. If you enjoyed hearing it, please subscribe. There are so many more stories of resilience to share.